Members that there have been some changes to normal practice in order to support the new hybrid arrangements. Timings of debates have been amended to allow technical arrangements to be made for debates. There will also be suspensions between debates. I remind members participating physically and virtually that they must arrive at the start of debates in Westminster Hall. Members are expected to remain for the entire debate. I must also remind members participating virtually that they must leave their camera on for the duration of the debate and that they will be visible at all times, both to each other and to us in the Boothroyd room. If members attending virtually have any technical problems, they should email the Westminster Hall Clerk's email address, which is westminsterhallclerks@parliament.uk. Members attending physically should clean their spaces before they use them and as they leave the room. I would also like to remind members that Mr. Speaker has stated that masks should be worn in Westminster Hall. There will be a time limit in this debate, which I will advise after the member in charge has finished speaking, but I warn members now that it's likely to be between 2 to 3 minutes each. Martin Docherty Hughes to move the motion.
Thank you, Mr. Holborn. It's good to see you and good to see so many members have been able to join us both physically and virtually. Members joining today, both here in the room and online, will be glad to hear for a first that I intend to keep it relatively short today. I only really have one question to ask the Minister, and I think Jagtar's case will be best served by allowing other diverse voices from across these islands to speak on his behalf, and to demonstrate to the UK Government that there is going to be no let-up until Jagtar is released. Let's get to the question, which I'll be asking again when I sum up. Why has the UK Government deemed that Jagtar Singh Johal's detention is not an arbitrary one? Many other questions, of course, you will hear today will flow from this one, and I am sure we will hear it asked in other guises over the next hour, but the Crown's Minister must answer. Now, I have raised the case of Jagtar Singh Johal with ministers almost 20 times since my first point of order on the 15th of November 2017. The week after that, I first raised it at FCDO questions, with the allegation of torture still fresh. The House of Commons was told by the Minister of State for Consular Policy that we will work very closely to investigate the matter and will, of course, take extreme action if a British citizen is being tortured. Now, that minister is no longer in government. Indeed, he's no even longer a member of the Conservative Party. But when a minister speaks from the dispatch box, we should be assured that their words will be believed. And while I still remember my surprise that day at hearing the use of the words extreme action, both I and the Singh Johal family would be content right now for a simple ruling of arbitrary detention and for the concomitant obligations to kick in. Now, I've spoken at length about my many aspects of this case over many times, most notably an adjournment debate on the first anniversary of Jagtar's detention on the 27th of November 2018. And I do not intend to go over too much of that again, but it is worth remembering how this case was begun. A young man from Dumbarton, fresh from his wedding that week, before enjoying his time with his new bride in Jalandhar, until suddenly a group of unidentifiable men in plain clothes leap from a van and hoot him and take him away. Now, I'm sure you can appreciate the terror and helplessness that his wife must have faced in that moment, and it would be unimaginable. And the course of the next few days as he was held incommunicado must have seemed like an eternity. Allegations of torture, and more recently the reality of COVID in an overcrowded maximum security prison half a world away, have weighed heavily on the family. And I have to say their resilience in the face of this has been extraordinary. By my reckoning, it's now 1,335 days that Jagtar has been detained without any substantial charges being brought in the case, coming up for 4 years. We know that the FCDO had been looking at a designation of arbitrary detention, and with conversations with ministers of all levels, this is something that they have been thinking about for some time, and this must surely have grown more recently. In January, we were glad of the estimation made by the charity Redress that Jagtar's detention was an arbitrary one, even more so when a cross-party group of 140 MPs signed a letter to the Foreign Secretary asking him to ensure that the FCDO intervene to secure Jagtar's release, as he is himself on record quite recently restating this policy. So given that it is the opinion of Reprieve and Redress and their legal counsel that Jagtar's detention is a clear breach of categories 1 to 4 of the United Nations Working Group on Arbitrary Detention definition, I again ask the Minister, why does the UK Government not share that view? Now, I expect the Minister to speak about many of the things that the UK Government has been doing for Jagtar, so please let me, and I also do so on behalf of the family, put on record that the work of the SCDO staff, both at post and in the Prisoner Policy and Human Rights team of the Consular Directorate here in London, has been immense, and it's been an immense support to the family and myself. They have diligently undertaken all that has been asked of them and gone above and beyond on occasion, as I'm sure they will know. And I'm only sorry that convention does not allow me to thank them by name. But these are civil servants who pursue their work through a framework established by their political masters. And it would be remiss of me not to mention some of the issues the FCDO ministers have either allowed to pass by or should immediately seek to remedy. Beginning with a failure to ensure that an independent medical examination was undertaken to establish the facts around the allegations of torture made by Jagtar against the Punjabi police. There is the continuing lack of private consular visits and the continuing reluctance of the Secretary of State specifically to meet with Jagtar's family and myself, as his predecessor did. And finally, the decision of the Prime Minister not to raise Jagtar's case with Prime Minister Modi when they last spoke virtually in April. Taken together, what these issues tell me is that we have a group of FCDO civil servants who are ready and able to implement government policy, but senior ministers who are reluctant to escalate representations beyond simply raising them with the Indian government officials. If we can do this with governments of other countries where UK nationals are arbitrarily detained, why can they not do so with the Republic of India? Doing so would not be interfering in the internal affairs of the Republic of India unnecessarily. I have been clear from the start of this case that all we ask for is transparent, due process and rule of law. When at least two of these elements are missing, as was so clearly demonstrated at his 161st pre-trial hearing today, it is my responsibility as Jagtar's local MP to ask why. Neither the Singh Johal family or myself are asking for the extreme action I mentioned that we were promised from the UK Government at the start of this process. We are asking them only to recognise an obvious fact. Now, Jagtar was able to speak by video call with his brother for the first time since his incarceration this week. He was as good as could be expected under the circumstances. But most of all, he wondered when he would get to see his family again in the flesh. This was a sobering moment for me. Jagtar Singh Johal is a husband, a son, a grandson, a brother, an uncle, and a son of the Rock of Dumbarton. He is arbitrarily detained in India, and why can't the United Kingdom government recognise this? Let's get Jaggy released. Let's bring him back to Scotland and let him see his family.
The question is that this House has considered the detention of Jagtar Singh Johal. The debate lasts until 5:50. I'm obliged to call the front benches no later than 5:27, and the guideline limits are 5 minutes for the SNP, 5 minutes for Her Majesty's Opposition, and 10 minutes for the Minister, and then the member in charge will have 3 minutes to sum up the debate at the end. There are 9 backbench contributors. In order to get everybody in, if there are no interventions during backbench speeches, we can have a 3-minute time limit. Zahra Sultana.
Thank you, Mr. Hollowbone. It is a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. While in India for his wedding on the 4th of November 2017, Jagtar Singh Johal, a British citizen, was shopping with his newly wedded wife when he was bound, hooded and bundled into a car by plain-clothed police officers. Leaving his wife with no explanation why he had been taken, Jagtar was taken into police custody, denied his right to see a lawyer, family members or a representative from the British High Commission. Once imprisoned, Jagtar reported being tortured by police. Crocodile clips, he said, were placed on him with electricity fired through his body. Such was the severity of the torture, Jagtar had to be carried out of the interrogation room. To make the pain stop, Jagtar reports that he was forced to confess to the alleged conspiracies. Why has he faced these basic violations of his rights? Well, prior to his arrest, Jagtar was involved in raising awareness about human rights abuses against India's Sikh population. Human rights organisation Reprieve fear that he has been targeted for exercising that freedom of expression and that right to that freedom. It has already cost him 4 years in prison without trial. He has endured torture, and now there is a real risk that confessions extracted through torture could be used to sentence him to the death penalty. Jagtar now languishes in prison where mass COVID-19 outbreaks have triggered calls for states to protect vulnerable prisoners. But in the face of these human rights abuses, what has the British government done? Rather than standing up for the rights of British nationals overseas, it has failed to follow Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office policy to lobby for arbitrarily detained UK nationals overseas, ignoring the calls from myself and 139 colleagues earlier this year to do precisely that. It has even failed to secure an independent medical assessment of Jagtar to judge the severity and extent of torture. It has failed to secure private consular visits with Jagtar for over 3 years. The Foreign Secretary has also failed to meet with Jagtar's family, and in the Prime Minister's meeting with Indian Prime Minister Modi in April again, in spite of calls from human rights organisations for him to raise it, the Prime Minister failed to challenge Modi on Jagtar's detention and treatment. This, Mr. Hollowbone, is a shameful dereliction of duty, and is a pattern of both what is happening in India and how the British government is failing to stand up for human rights. In recent years, in India, there has been a growing number of arrests of human rights defenders, student leaders, trade unionists, journalists and others critical of the ruling government. In occupied Kashmir in 2019, the Indian government unilaterally revoked Articles 370 and 35A of the Indian Constitution.
Order.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairship, Mr Hollowbone, and I commend my honourable friend for securing this important debate and for his tireless efforts here. Many residents in my constituency are deeply concerned about Jagtar's continued detention, and as a Vice-Chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Sikhs, I know the continued work that's gone on by that group. In a previous Parliament, I spent an extraordinary amount of time lobbying for the release of a constituent of mine, Billy Irving, wrongly detained for years in an Indian jail, so I know the horrendous impact on his family that their ordeal had, and I can imagine the impact on Jagtar Singh Johal's family is similarly huge. And let's remember, he was taken from the street where he was walking with his new wife, who wasn't even given an explanation for her husband's detention when they were just married and looking forward to their future home in Scotland. And even more concerning now is the analysis by his legal counsel in India, confirming he faces a possible death sentence on at least 3 of the charges levelled against him. And that forced confession, allegedly extracted through torture, is the primary evidence on which these death penalty charges are based. So his fair trial rights have been gravely violated, and his detention is clearly arbitrary. But despite UK government policy being to lobby for the release of arbitrarily detained UK nationals overseas, the Foreign Secretary has not yet done so in Jagtar's case. So I would like to hear from the Minister on why the UK government has failed to implement its own policy on arbitrarily detained British citizens. And of course, we're looking at all this through a particular prism, because COVID puts an urgent complexion on everything. And I can only imagine the anxiety that Jagtar and his family are facing, knowing he's so far from them with COVID rife and them unable to do a thing to keep him safe when he is there in a horrifically overcrowded prison. And even though the state government has recognised the challenges COVID is causing and recently sanctioned emergency release of thousands of prisoners, even those accused of murder, Jagtar has not been included and remains incarcerated. So I applaud all the efforts that the family have been making. I applaud the efforts of the all-party group on Sikhs, the sterling work of Sikhs in Scotland, and of course my honourable friend, as well as others who have been working on this issue throughout. There has been so much effort expended, but what we really need is action in India. And for that to happen, we urgently need this UK government to take these issues on board, to listen and to act. And I look forward to hearing what the Minister has to say today.
Thank you very much, Mr. Holborn. It's a pleasure to serve under you as Chairman, and I commend the Honourable Member for Western Berkshire in attending this debate and also for his advocacy on behalf of his constituent. There's a great deal that I could say about this case, but time is short, so I'm going to limit myself to 3 very brief points. The first of these is that I understand the concerns that the Minister will have with regard to the apparent interference in the criminal justice system of another sovereign state. That's well rehearsed, it's not new territory for the Foreign and Commonwealth Development Office. I would, however, bring to his attention the quite remarkable and wholly inappropriate briefing note that was circulated to members of this House today and which was brought to the Deputy Speaker's attention by the Honourable Member for Western Berkshire. And I would gently suggest to the Minister that that demonstrates in the way in which it is constructed, both in terms of the highly misleading and inaccurate content, and also in the way in which it strays into discussion of the procedure and indeed the substance of the case against Jagtar Singh Johal, that in fact the Indian government themselves do not have a great regard for the propriety of the independence of their own criminal justice system. So I hope that the Minister will bear that in mind when he formulates his own position with regard to it. The second is absolutely the most crucial point, and that is the point that was made by the Honourable Member for Western Berkshire, and it is the position of Jagtar Singh Johal as somebody who has been the subject of a very strong prima facie arbitrary detention. As has been made very clear by Council, instructed by reprieve and redress in the briefing that they provided for members today, it is their view that this is caught by categories 1, 2, 3 and 4 of the guidance produced by the United Nations Working Party on arbitrary detention. Now, I was in legal practice myself for long enough to know that lawyers can come to different conclusions. So if the advice that is given or the conclusions that have been drawn by the Minister and his staff are different, then I hope that when he comes to respond to this debate, then he will explain exactly where these differences come from. The third thing I would say is that Jagtar's position is undoubtedly grim. Actually, he is in a much better position than just about everybody that I have ever campaigned for and worked with when they were facing the death penalty, because he has not yet been through the judicial process. Just about every death penalty case I have ever been part of, I've looked at it and I thought, dear God, if only we'd got to this at first instance. We're well ahead of that point at the moment. The government should be implementing their own policy with regard to arbitrary detention. They've done it for Nazarene Zaghari Ratcliffe very rightly, and for others often enough. Why are they not doing it for Jagtar?
Matt Weston.
Thank you, Mr. Holloway, and it's an absolute pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. For Jagtar Singh Johal, it's hard not to feel angry, defeated and despondent. I cannot imagine how difficult it has been for his family and his wife in particular, who has not heard from her beloved husband since he was snatched and detained by plainclothes officers in India just 3 weeks after their wedding in October 2017. Because, of course, as we know, he is a British citizen, a loving family man and valued citizen of Dumbarton. But the UK government, the country of Mr. Johal's birth, has fallen silent and deserted him. Why has the government not demanded the release of its own British citizen? Our Foreign Secretary hasn't even so much as met with Mr. Johal's grief-stricken family, despite his predecessor accepting he had no chance of a fair trial and was in grave danger. However, in their attempts to strike new trade deals, The government seems to have damaged our global moral standing and neglected our humanitarian responsibilities. It is dangerous brinkmanship of the highest order, but is also what we have come to expect. Seemingly, the UK government would sooner allow his death than jeopardise any future trade deal. As recently as April this year, the PM met remotely with the Indian Prime Minister and once again neglected to raise his case during the meeting. It's time for the government to act and secure Mr Johal's release. It must work for a medical assessment of Mr Johal and the facility in which he is imprisoned. It must push for a private consulate to visit and gain access to where he is detained. And at the earliest opportunity, ministers should meet Mr Johal's family. The government's silence has been a moral outrage and an unforgivable dereliction of the duty to protect its own British citizen. Thank you.
Taiwo Owatemi.
Thank you, Mr Holborn. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. And I'd like to start by expressing how grateful I am to the member for West Dunbartonshire for securing this vital debate today. We've spoken privately about this issue in the past and are in wholehearted agreement that the importance of this subject cannot be understated. That a British citizen can be arrested and held for so long in another country with no indication of when he will finally see his case resolved by due process should shame our lazy and hands-off Foreign Secretary. What's more is that the Home Office attempted to add to the family's burden by trying to expel Gurpreet Kaur, the wife of Jagtar Singh Johal, shows just what contempt this government is prepared to treat those in peril in this case. Now, many of my constituents will be deeply concerned by this, as in Coventry, two of our neighbours are also facing a similar prospect this year. Two brothers, residents of my constituency, were hauled into custody by raids on their homes last year, and this has both traumatised their families and sent shockwaves through our local community in Coventry. As British citizens who have lived in our country their whole lives, they deserve the same protection from the government that we all receive. Yet now, languishing in custody ahead of extradition proceeding later this year, they are left profoundly concerned by what the future holds for them. Ministers have offered the stock assurances that the brothers will be properly treated by the Indian authorities and that they will not face the death penalty. However, nothing that they or their families have been put through can be said to have inspired confidence in promises which were made by either the Foreign or the Home Office. Given that the two men in question have been investigated previously, with the Home Office deciding that there was no further case to answer, it is not surprising that so many in the community are asking why these arrests took place. These doubts have been reinforced in the minds of many by the simple fact that the week before the arrests were made, the Foreign Secretary visited India and met with Ajit Doval, a key national security advisor. In his haste to wrap up a trade agreement with the current Indian government, we have to ask ourselves, what is the Foreign Secretary sacrificing? If the government won't stand up for British citizens abroad, how can any of us be safe? My constituents and all those in their positions deserve fair treatment and a government here at home that is willing to fight for them to secure due process. Instead, they are left in fear for their lives because this government prefers to purchase new friendships abroad, setting their inalienable rights at naught in an attempt to revive our faltering trade relationships. Now, it is time for the government to offer some leadership on this issue instead of importing sectarian politics from abroad in our debate here in the UK. We need to see ministers assure to all of us, to all our citizens, regardless of their background, a fundamental right that defines being British. Thank you.
Video link, Claudia Webb. Claudia, you're on mute. You need to unmute. We still can't hear you.
I am unmuted.
Right, we can hear you now. Please proceed. Restart the clock.
Thank you, Mr Holborn. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairship. I also congratulate the Honourable Member for West Dunbartonshire for securing this hugely important debate. Jagtar Singh Johal, a British citizen, a Sikh human rights advocate from Dunbartonshire, has sought to use his platform to raise awareness of historic abuses carried out against the Sikh population. In 2017, he travelled to India to get married. And yet, 3 weeks after the ceremony, plainclothes police officers abducted him from the street. According to the human rights organisation Reprieve, the police brutally tortured Jagtar with electricity and brought petrol into his cell, with the threat to burn him alive. To make the pain stop, he signed blank pieces of paper and recorded video statements confessing to the charges against him, some of which carried the death penalty. Jagtar's imprisonment clearly amounts to arbitrary detention under international law. He has now been detained for more than 3 years without trial. When a British national is arbitrarily detained, tortured, and faces a potential death sentence, all on the basis of trumped-up political charges, the British government must make clear this is unacceptable. Despite it being government policy to lobby for the release of arbitrarily detained UK nationals overseas, the Foreign Secretary has yet to do so for Jagtar. Will the Minister explain why the government failed to implement its policy to seek the release of arbitrarily detained British citizens, as in Jagtar's case? This is even more urgent after mass outbreaks of COVID-19 in the prison in which Jagtar is detained, with the World Health Organization and the Office of the High Commissioner on Human Rights calling on states to protect vulnerable prisoners during the pandemic and immediately release those who have been arbitrarily detained and secure non-custodial alternatives to detention. In April, I wrote to the Prime Minister urging him to raise Jagtar's case during a meeting with his counterpart, Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi. Will the Minister confirm whether the government raised Jagtar's arbitrary detention with the Indian authorities, either at this meeting or at any other time? Whilst the UK government is anxious to improve relations with India so that it can secure a post-Brexit trade deal, the UK-India relationship, indeed all our diplomatic efforts, must be deeper than just trade. It should be based on the promotion of democracy, human rights, and upholding international law. The government must do all it can to ensure Jagtar's safety and his release. Thank you, Mr. Hollowborn.
Tanmanjeet Singh Desi.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hollowborn. A pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and my gratitude to the Honourable Member for Western Bartonshire for securing this debate and for representing his constituents so passionately on this matter. Since his arrest in November 2017, I have raised the detention of British national Jagtar Singh Johal on numerous occasions with ministers in the chamber. I'd hope the government will take some note of our collective concerns and take some steps to address this situation. So it is extremely disappointing that here we are once again raising Mr. Johal's detention with the government, but despite the serious allegations of torture and mistreatment and potentially facing the death penalty, the UK government has done very little to support Mr. Johal's family and find a solution to this difficult situation. In fact, the Foreign Secretary himself is still yet to meet with his family, even after over 3.5 years since his arrest. Not only has this matter been of huge importance for those directly affected, but also for the wider Sikh community. Indeed, many of my Slough constituents have contacted me to show their anger and dismay over Conservative government inaction for Jagtar and his family. Indeed, I share their concerns. Reports that Mr. Johal has been subject to torture are deeply worrying and must be treated with the utmost seriousness. We must be very clear. Mr. Holman, there should be no place for the use of torture or mistreatment anywhere in the world. Yet this government still doesn't seem to want to raise this with Indian authorities or seek to verify these claims. Mr. Johal must be able to privately meet with the British consular staff so that he can raise concerns over his treatment. So what has the government done to facilitate this? And hopefully the Minister will answer this. Those concerning reports, alongside delays to legal proceedings and the need for a fair trial for Mr. Johal, should be conveyed by the UK authorities to Indian authorities. Yet I fear this has not been the case. I hope that the Minister will assuage our concerns today. The UK government must set the example to the world when dealing with such situations and reassure honourable members of this House and British citizens everywhere that their government will not abandon them as soon as they step foot outside of the UK. I'm very cognizant of the well-rehearsed and acknowledged stance that we cannot intervene in another nation's judicial process. But time and time again, this government claims to represent the views and voices of all Brits, but in practice
Many are voiceless within the international arena as the government fails to ensure that their basic human rights are met. The Foreign Secretary must meet Mr. Johал's family and listen and act upon the serious concerns of the family rather than continually failing them. Thank you very much, Mr. Holloway.
Video link, John McDonnell.
I'm here because of my personal concern with regard to Mr. Johal, but also because of the scale of representation I've received from my constituents. The government needs to recognise the immense worry that there is within our own country at this particular case. And people are concerned because they've witnessed that Mr. Johal can be picked up in this way, detained and deprived of his liberty. And if it can happen to him, it can happen to any one of them, especially those who've raised real fears and concerns about and criticisms about the current Indian government's practices with regard to human rights. For those of us with family connections to India, we have immense affection for the country and its people. And it pains me the reputational damage that has been caused to India by the actions of this government in relation to this case. So I just want to ask a few basic questions about where the government goes from here. First of all, in the light of the failure of its representation so far with regard to Mr. Johal's case, can the Minister explain to us the strategy the government is now going to pursue for effective representations from our government directly to the Indian government? Secondly, could the Minister also explain its strategy to coordinate the representations from other countries and international bodies to create a climate of opinion that hopefully will force the Indian government to act? Can I also ask the Minister, what is the strategy to coordinate the work of human rights bodies to investigate and report on the adherence or non-adherence to basic human rights standards by the Indian authorities in relation to this case? And also, finally, if there are continued delays to either secure the release of Mr. Johal or at least ensure that justice is brought in this case, what sanctions are the government now prepared to take, both politically, diplomatically, and if necessary, economically? There is a sense of frustration now within our own communities at the failure of the government to act decisively. It is undermining confidence that our government will actually protect its citizens when they travel abroad. I urge the government, I urge them to listen to the representations that have been made so eloquently today that I fully agree with, and to act. For goodness sake, we need to see speedy action on this particular appalling case.
The last backbencher, but definitely not the least, Jim Shannon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's a pleasure to speak in this, and I just want to first of all congratulate the Honourable Member for West Dunbartonshire for bringing this forward. Whenever we had the Dermot debate some time ago, I was there to support him. I'm here today to do the same thing. I declare an interest as the chair of the APPG for freedom of religious belief, of which the Sikhs are one of our stakeholders, and I want to put that on record, and I want to come here and support them. It is tragic that yet again we are debating the violation of an individual's human rights. The fact that he was detained, kidnapped basically from the street by balaclava covered men, thrown in a van, then taken to a prison cell, tortured, forced to sign a confession is absolutely unbelievable. So I'm my party's human rights spokesperson as well, so I'm here to register my support for the Honourable Gentleman and his constituent. We live in an age in which most of the major human rights treaties, there are 9 core treaties, have been ratified by the vast majority of countries. It seems that yet again the human rights agenda has fallen short, and in this case a British national, one of ours, and his family, for whom we must stand up and speak out. Could I ask why the Minister and the FCDO has to date refused to meet with Mr. Johal's family? Mr. Jagtar Johal has been detained without evidence of any wrongdoing. Indeed, India is the world's largest democracy and is rarely considered to be among the major human rights violating nations. Yet Mr. Johal has been subject to torture, forced to sign false confessions, while being held in a prison which has now been full of the outbreak of coronavirus. Indian government must be held to account. So I ask the Minister, what actions has his department taken to protect Mr. Johal? given his pre-existing health conditions following the outbreak of coronavirus in Bihar prison, including an independent medical examination and psychological evaluation. Really important that we give the same treatment to all of our citizens wherever they are in the world. The prohibition of extrajudicial torture and killings is fundamental to human rights law. I acknowledge this appalling treatment has been done not as a matter of official policy, but as a matter of practice, which is even worse. It's unacceptable still that the Indian authorities are ignoring international legal obligations regarding his torture and detention despite a lack of evidence. So is the Minister aware that Mr Johal is under threat of the death penalty, and what actions is his department taken since learning of this? India has a judicial system in which it is the process that must be suspected criminals are firmly charged and appear in court. Courts might be slow and underfunded. Police might be under pressure to convict. This, however, is no excuse whatsoever to employ inhumane and degrading treatment of those in custody and must not be accepted or tolerated. And we're sending that message to the Indian government from this House today, and hopefully the Minister will do the same. India is clearly in breach of Article 9 of the UDHR, and we must be told what actions have been taken by the government at the United Nations in raising the case of Mr Jagtar Singh Johal. I want to put on record my thanks to the honourable member, but also to say today we speak for someone, one of ours, who has been mistreated and is under a death penalty threat. Thank you.
We now come to the front bench speeches. Video link, Hannah Bardell for the SNP.
Thank you, Chair. It's truly a pleasure to sum up in this incredibly important debate. This is an issue that is very close to my heart, and I declare an interest as the Chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on deaths abroad and consular assistance. But I want to first offer my deep and profound sympathies, as well as my solidarity to the family of Jagtar, and congratulate my honourable friend and colleague for West Dunbartonshire for securing this debate and for all the work that he has done to fight for Jagtar and his family. He has been utterly tireless. But what members have rightly spoken so passionately about in this debate is the issue of the rights of British citizens abroad and what happens to them when they find themselves, through no fault of their own, killed, injured, incarcerated, or in Jagtar's case, although we have heard from many members that the UK government shamelessly won't recognise, arbitrarily detained without a trial, often by oppressive regimes who routinely breach or abuse the human rights. And let's be absolutely clear about what the detention of Jagtar is. As my honourable friend said, it's a flagrant breach of his human rights by the Indian authorities and government, and they should be ashamed. And it is so important that that message has gone out from all members who have spoken in this debate today. 4 years without a trial, 4 years away from his family, and as we know, in appalling conditions, as my honourable friend for East Renfrewshire highlighted, seeing this through the prism of COVID and the experiences that Jagtar has had in prison make this all the more distressing and appalling, because Jagtar is one of so many that right now are apart from their family and friends, isolated and ultimately without the support they need from the UK government. And as the honourable member for Hayes and Harlington highlighted, this is an issue that could concern us all. If it can happen to Jagtar, it could happen to anybody. So, Chair, this is sadly a very familiar experience because, as I said, as the Chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Deaths Abroad and Consular Services, I took evidence from over 60 families who had lost loved ones abroad, who had their loved ones incarcerated. And we heard from a number of organisations, including Redress, who I know have given significant support to Jagtar's family. And the message was very clear. There was a common theme. All of the families we took evidence from felt terribly let down by the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. They felt helpless and abandoned. And the honourable member for Warwick and Leamington alighted on a key point that we heard from a number of families whose loved ones were incarcerated. That this UK government, this Conservative government, are putting trade deals before human rights. And that should shame us all. Now, as somebody who has worked in a consulate, I worked myself for the US Department of State in their consulate in Edinburgh. I have seen firsthand how hard consular staff work. And there may be many things that we can criticise the US for, but in my experience, the one thing I learned was that they looked after their own without fear or favour. And I think that this government could learn a lot from that. But I've also met with consular staff and ambassadors who worked for the Foreign Office. And I know how hard they work and how difficult and challenging their job is. And I know how hard, as my honourable friend said, they have worked for Jagtar and his family. But they are being cut to the bone and their resources are being drained by this Conservative government. And in 2019, a report by the British Foreign Policy Group, which was backed by many prominent diplomats and former foreign secretaries, proved that funding of the diplomatic service was at its lowest in 20 years. And in the last 30 years, staff have been cut by 1,000. That is hardly the advert for global Britain that this Conservative government seems to punt left, right and centre. So the reality is, Chair, that this government leave British citizens high and dry because they do not give their staff or their missions the funding and resource that they need. Not only are they abandoning British citizens, but they are abandoning their own staff. And the issue of consular assistance is a grey area. And that is why my report and myself and others have called for a legal right to consular assistance, which would strengthen the rights of our citizens and make this government have a legal responsibility to look after our citizens abroad. This government have to answer for their lack of action. They have to answer for, as members have said, the fact that this Prime Minister has met with the Prime Minister of India and not raised the case of Jagtar. A government's first duty should be to look after its citizens in their time of need. Otherwise, what use or value does a British citizen hold? So will this government accept that Jagtar has been arbitrarily detained according to the very clear international definition of arbitrary detention, and answer to why they have failed to implement its own policy to seek the release of arbitrarily detained British citizens in Jagtar's case?
Video link, Stephen Kinnock for Her Majesty's Opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hollowburn. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. As the Shadow Minister who's been lobbying the government on this issue, I'm very grateful to the Member of Parliament for West Dunbartonshire for securing this vitally important debate about his constituent, Mr. Jagtar Singh Johal. I'd also like to thank colleagues, the honourable members for Coventry South, Warwick and Leamington, Coventry North West, Slough and Hayes and Harlington for their important contributions. Mr. Hollowburn, the Labour Party is deeply concerned about the incarceration by the Indian police of British citizen Jagtar Singh Johal, who has now been held without trial for more than 3.5 years. Whilst the Labour Party does not involve itself with the internal matters of other countries, we will always stand up for human rights, democracy and international law everywhere, and we will always stand up for British citizens wherever we feel their rights and freedoms are being violated. We value our country's long-standing relationship with India, who we see as an important partner in the decades ahead on trade, security, climate change, and critically on the joint promotion of democracy, human rights, and upholding international law. But a strong relationship is only worth having if it means that each government is able to engage frankly with the other and is able to challenge each other and take robust positions wherever necessary. And that brings me to the issue we're discussing today, because this deeply troubling case of a UK citizen incarcerated for more than 1,300 days without trial and with the threat of the death penalty looming over him. Jagtar's story is heartbreaking, as has been the experience of his wife and his wider family, not least his brother, with whom I have had the privilege of meeting on a number of occasions over the past year. We've all heard the facts of this case today, and they're deeply disturbing for all manner of reasons. But it's also worth noting that the United Nations shares our concern. On the 29th of January 2018, the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention, the Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Religion and Belief, and the Special Rapporteur on Torture sent an urgent representation to the Indian government. It expressed concerns over the lack of detail on the factual and legal basis for Mr. Johal's arrest and detention, and questioned the measures that are being taken by the Indian authorities to safeguard him from torture. And then, on 9th of November 2019, the United Nations Working Group and Special Rapporteurs sent an urgent representation to the Indian government, insisting there had been over 2 years of delay through an unfair legal process, and the Indian government must provide the right to due process, a fair trial and independent medical examination. And yet there has still been no movement towards either a fair trial or to Jagtar's relief. Given the facts of this case and those UN interventions, I find it quite astonishing that the Foreign Secretary has refused to meet with the family, and that the government minister responsible in the other place has refused on 2 occasions to answer my questions on whether this amounts to arbitrary detention. First in a letter I sent to him in last autumn, and then a letter in January of this year, which took the government 3 months to reply to. So I asked the Minister today, does the government recognise Jagtar's incarceration as a clear case of arbitrary detention? The UN Special Rapporteur on Executions has made clear that in death penalty cases, where the detainee is detained on spurious grounds as a political statement or in circumstances of clear human rights violations, that the detainee's country should be making representations to the detaining state that the detainee should not be in detention or facing charges at all. Is the UK government acting on this guidance? Does the UK government intend to implement its own policy? Mr. Hollowbone, 3.5 years is more than enough time to gather evidence and bring a case to trial. Jagtar's continued incarceration is a clear and obvious breach of international human rights law. He is clearly a victim of arbitrary detention, and as such, he should be released immediately. The UK government must also remind the Indian authorities that international human rights law prohibits the reliance on evidence that has been gathered under torture. Mr. Hollowbone, Jagtar and his family have been through far too much already. Today is the moment for the UK government to demonstrate that it is genuinely committed to standing up for a British citizen whose human rights are being violated. Thank you.
In calling Foreign Office Minister Nigel Adams, I'll be most grateful if the Minister could conclude his remarks no later than 5:47, so the member in charge has time to sum up the debate. Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Hollowbone, and as ever, a great pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. Can I thank all honourable and right honourable members for taking part in this very, very important debate, and to the honourable member for West Dunbartonshire for securing it, and I pay tribute to his tenacious support for his constituent, Mr. Johal, since his arrest in India. I'm also grateful for the contributions of all honourable and right honourable members who have been in contact with the Foreign Office, either in writing or through formats like this, and I'll try and respond to the points raised in my remarks. But before coming to Mr. Johal's specific case, Mr. Hollowbone, I'll just set out our consular policy in general terms. Clearly, consular assistance is central to our work at the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, our staff endeavour to give advice and practical support to British nationals overseas and their families here in the UK. We aim to treat every consular case with equal importance and tailor our help to the individual circumstances of each person who is in need of our support in normal times and in times of crisis. To give you an example, Mr. Hollowbone, from March to July 2020, the then Foreign and Commonwealth Office ran a repatriation operation unprecedented in the post-war era. We were proud to be able to return 38,000 people on 186 charter flights and from 57 countries and territories back to the UK, as well as enabling 1.3 million British nationals return via commercial routes. The government does not and has never had a legal duty of care to British nationals abroad. This is because our ability to provide consular assistance is always dependent on other states adhering to the Vienna Convention on consular relations and the laws of that host country. Consequently, a right to consular assistance in English law would not help those caught up in complex consular cases. In a similar vein, the FCDO does not seek preferential treatment for British nationals. We do not, and as we've heard today from several honourable members, must not interfere in civil and criminal court proceedings. It's absolutely right that we respect the legal systems of other countries, just as we expect foreign nationals to respect our laws when they are in the United Kingdom. Our policy is clear in respect of how to engage on complex detention cases, such as that of Mr Johal. The Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office makes no judgment on the innocence or guilt of any British national who is detained overseas. Our priority is always the welfare of the UK national concerned. We look to ensure that they're receiving food, water and medical treatment, and that they have access to legal advice. And with their permission, we can raise concerns about mistreatment or torture with the prison authorities and request an independent investigation into any such allegations. We will always consider making representations to the local authorities if detainees are not treated in line with internationally accepted standards, including if trials are unreasonably delayed compared to local cases. And we have provided, as the Honourable Member will know, Mr Johal and his family with extensive consular support since his arrest in 2017. We will continue to do so, Mr Hollowbone, until this case has been resolved. That resolution must include an independent investigation into Mr Johal's allegations of torture and mistreatment and the transparent progress of judicial proceedings against him. I will.
I thank the Minister for giving way. Just on the specific point, the allegation that was made and raised by one of our colleagues about the pouring of petrol in the cell of Mr Johal, has that been specifically raised by anyone in the Foreign Office, the Indian authorities?
Minister. What I can tell the Honourable Member is that we've consistently raised the need for an independent and an impartial investigation into those torture allegations. The Foreign Secretary himself most recently highlighted this to the Indian External Affairs Minister Jai Shankar on the 6th of May. And we have made many representations in this case. I think almost 70 occasions of officials or ministers raised Mr Johal's case. But I appreciate there are calls for the British government to do more in Mr Johal's case, and I would therefore like to reassure the House that ever since his arrest in India in 2017, our staff have worked hard to provide effective assistance to Mr Johal and his family in the UK. We take these allegations about torture and mistreatment incredibly seriously, and you know, these allegations go back to 2017 and again in January this year. And there are causes for concern in Mr Johal's case, and we share also Honourable Members' deep concern about the delays, continued delays in the legal proceedings against Mr Johal. And the... Yes, I do.
I'm grateful, Minister, for allowing I accept everything that he has said about the intervention with regard to the Indian criminal justice system, and that is why the point about arbitrary detention is so important, because as the spokesperson from the official opposition and the Honourable Member for Western Bartonshire both said, in the event that that is the view of the government, then they have a duty to intervene. Is that the view of the government? And if it is, then why have they not intervened? If it isn't, what points of distinction would they make?
Minister. Well, the government takes all allegations of human rights violations extremely seriously. We raise concerns with the authorities on the ground where appropriate. The assessment, the assistance we provide is assessed on a case-by-case basis, and it entirely depends on the circumstances of the case. And it's for this reason that we've persistently, Mr Holborn, advocated for Mr Johal's welfare. We've raised his case regularly at the highest levels and with the Indian government. I'll take one more intervention. I'm just conscious I'm supposed to finish in 3 minutes' time, and I think there's no chance of that.
I'm very grateful to the Minister for taking my intervention. I wonder if I could go back to the point that we just heard, the question to the Minister of does the UK government accept that this is an arbitrary detention? If not, what is it about the situation that they don't agree with? This is what we need to hear from the Minister.
Minister. Well, as I said, the action we take in a consular case in relation to allegations of arbitrary detention is tailored to individual circumstances and situations and what we judge to be the most effective in each case. While the FCDO can't investigate allegations of human rights abuses overseas, we've carefully considered all available information on the arbitrary detention allegations, including the reprieve determination. We'll continue to raise concerns regarding human rights directly with the Indian Authority as we judge these to be effective and appropriate in Mr. Johal's case. But if I may, in the couple of minutes I've got left, move on, Mr. Hollowbone. We've persistently advocated for his welfare. We've raised Mr. Johal's torture allegations and his right to a fair trial with the Government of India on more than 70 occasions since his arrest. Most recently, the Foreign Secretary raised the case with the Indian Minister for External Affairs on the 6th of May, and Lord Ahmed, the Minister for South Asia and the Commonwealth, with the High Commissioner on the 8th of June. The previous Prime Minister, the Home Secretary, the Trade Secretary have all raised Mr. Johal's case at appropriate opportunities during his detention. And I can further assure honourable members and right honourable members that we have thoroughly considered concerns regarding arbitrary detention and the death penalty in this case. The government also takes all allegations of violations to human rights seriously. We raise them with the local authorities where appropriate. We also cover welfare issues in Mr. Johal's case. In-person visits to prisons in India, this was referred to by honourable members earlier. These are restricted due to the pandemic, but we've replaced these with phone calls, and we most recently spoke to Mr. Johal on the 11th of May. We'll continue to pursue regular welfare visits with the authorities for as long as he remains in prison. We appreciate also that his family have suffered considerable distress throughout his detention. The High Commissioner to India most recently met with Mr. Johal's brother Gurpreet on the 30th of April. A question was raised earlier about trade and human rights. It's clear that the relationship with India is important, and it's based around trust and collaboration. And it's important that human rights and complex consular cases form part of our dialogue. And as such, the 2030 roadmap for India-UK future relations, agreed in April by our two Prime Ministers, includes a commitment to promote closer cooperation in consular matters and to resolve long-running or complex consular cases. I recognise this remains an extremely difficult time for Mr. Johal and his family. I can assure the honourable member, who I'm going to give way to, for Western Berkshire and Mr. Johal's family, that we will continue to do all we can to support Mr. Johal and to ensure that he is treated in accordance with Indian and international law. His case does remain a priority for the UK Government, and it must be resolved in line with due process and without unreasonable delay.
Martin Docherty Hughes.
Thank you, Mr. Hollowbone, and I'm very grateful to all the members, honourable and right honourable, who have participated, the front benches, my good friend, the member for Livingston, the member for Aberfan, and everyone who has participated. As a member of the Defence Select Committee, I have to say I'm very much aware of the importance of the relationship with India, but it has to be a frank and upfront one. And the Minister also mentioned consular support, which I mentioned indeed in my speech. But it seems that arbitrary detention clearly is different when you're held by Iran or China. And the Minister also mentioned, in terms of the Government's issues in relation to English law, clearly it's a pity my constituents not being assisted by Scots law. Now, the Minister for Asia, and I say this with all due respect, their own portfolio does not cover my constituent in this sense, it's covered by the member for South Asia, has failed to answer the intrinsic question. Is this deemed arbitrary detention? The Government has failed to answer the